Spider Who, Chapter 2. Mary Jane Watson was walking the city streets of Queens alone towards her Aunt Anna's apartment. Her Aunt Anna, who was out of town for the week, had long ago given Mary Jane a key to her apartment, knowing full well what Mary Jane's home life was like. Mary Jane cringed as she thought back to the screaming argument her parents had gotten into, the memory of it ringing in her ears. It hadn't taken her long to get to the point where she decided that she's had enough and marched out the door. With her Aunt Anna's key in hand and a small backpack with a change of clothes and basic necessities, she would be eternally grateful to her Aunt Anna. A secret part of her, hidden deep in the recesses of her mind, had always wished in dreams that she actually lived with her kindly aunt. But she had always been afraid of what the repercussions of merely asking would be. Her parents wouldn't take that decision lying down. Her father especially. Mary Jane turned another corner on the dark streets, knowing that she was getting close to her Aunt Anna's apartment when... Screaming, Mary Jane instinctively covered and ducked her head in terror as the sound of a close explosion resounded through the air. She sat crouched over herself for a split second of time, heaving in a few mouthfuls of air as she tried to get the ringing sound out of her ears. When she finally managed to straighten, Mary Jane turned towards the alleyway that she had just passed, looking at the building before her in horror as it burned, black smoke billowing up towards the sky. If there had been anyone inside of that building, there was no way that they could have survived. Suddenly, the clanging sound of something banging against metal caught in her hearing, and served to divert her attention away from the flaming building. The sight of the body, just as it fell from its collision on the metal dumpster, caught her attention, just before it landed with a thud on the hard pavement. She waited, still in her shock, but when the body didn't move, Mary Jane gasped and immediately snapped into action. Her breathing came out in rasps as she ran forward, her mind doing its best to catch up with the adrenaline that was pumping through her body, only to stop short when she got close enough to see the figure more properly, outlined by the glow of the flames. It was... Spider-Man! Mary Jane gaped at the masked hero on the ground, just meters away from her feet. She has never seen a clear picture of what he looked like before. He was too fast for any photographer to get anything more than a blur. All that the world had of the wall crawler were shoddy videos that were more of a smear of red and blue than anything. It was strange to see him up close like this, to see his red and blue costume in full, to see him so still. A gasp escaped her again as she was reminded of the precarious situation at hand. Was he dying? Already dead? No. Right there. A slight movement coming from his chest. He was breathing, but he was far from out of the woods yet. It was clear that he was unconscious, and that he needed help. Her help. But what could she do? She couldn't very well take him to the hospital. They could unmask him, do tests on him, lock him up. Immediately, Mary Jane vetoed the idea. Taking him to the hospital was out of the question. Her mind was whirring with thoughts, going through a barrage of ideas in an instant as she tried to decide their next course. Finally, she stepped cautiously closer and knelt down over the unconscious, amazing Spider-Man. Mary Jane bit her lip as she stared at his prone form. He was so still. How would she ever have a hope of moving him? Hesitantly, she lifted a hand and prodded at his shoulder with a gentle shove. Hello? Mr. Spider-Man? Are you alright? There was no reply. But out in the distance, the sound of sirens filled the air. Panic seeped ice cold through her veins. She poked at his shoulder more insistently. You've got to wake up! I can't carry you out of here by myself, and the police are coming! Finally, she heard a groan and almost cried out in relief at the noise as she whispered, Are you awake? Spider-Man lifted his head and somehow managed to turn it towards her. Mary Jane scrambled to help him ease into an upright sitting position, subconsciously rubbing soothing circles through the fabric on his back.
What happened?
He asked, seemingly to no one in particular as he rubbed his gloved hands over a spot on his masked head. Mary Jane let out a short, breathy laugh of relief, glad to see that he was all right. Or alive and speaking, at least. He must still be in a great deal of pain. There was an explosion! I think that you just barely managed to get out of its way, but you hit your head on this metal dumpster, Spider-Man, and...
Spider... who?
Mary Jane stopped short, staring at those white eye lenses of his with a wide gaze of her own. You don't remember who you are? Lifting his hands, Spider-Man peered curiously at the fabric that covered his fingers before he shook his head slowly.
I don't remember anything.
The breath left Mary Jane's chest in an instant. Anything? Spider-Man shook his head again and rubbed at the same spot on his masked head. It was an easy assumption to conclude that the spot he kept touching was where his head had made impact with the metal.
No? Where are we? Who are you? Who am I?
His voice sounded so vulnerable, so confused, so scared. Or she never would have thought that she would hear a great hero like Spider-Man sound scared before in her life, but he was. Absolutely terrified, in fact. You must have amnesia from hitting your head from that fall. She couldn't stop herself from musing aloud in a breathy tone as the situation caught up to her. Immediately, she thought over her options of what to do. It was obvious that Spider-Man couldn't just sling off by himself. He would have no idea where to go, no clue as to where he lived. And he needed to get out of here fast before the police or any of the public found him in such a vulnerable state. No, she would have to be the one to do something to help him. With her mind made up, Mary Jane started to attempt to lift him with her arms, trying to get him to stand. Come on. My Aunt Anna's apartment is close to here. You'll be safe there until we can figure out what to do with you. Spider-Man staggered to his feet with her help and guidance, when a sudden electric shock came from his suit and mildly electrocuted the both of them. They both yelped at the brief sting of pain that coursed through their bodies.
What was that?
Spider-Man asked her, his voice gasping with unease as he looked all around him for the source, as though the painful zap had somehow come from the air surrounding them. Mary Jane shook her head, sending a cursory look at his suit out of the corner of her eye. You must have had some technology or something in your suit that short-circuited in the explosion? Then again, I can only guess. She was no science whiz, after all. Spider-Man fidgeted uncomfortably against where he was leaning heavily against her.
What? Why am I even wearing this? It's kind of tight.
Mary Jane suppressed a smirk and a snicker at the implications of what he was referring to. Oh, I can tell, she quipped under her breath, very much noticing how the tight material looked over his muscular ass and his other assets. It may not be the most appropriate thing to think of, especially while Spider-Man was in distress, but she was a teenager.
Do you have something else that I can wear?
Spider-Man asked her. Mary Jane frowned at the question. He couldn't just take off his suit, could he? That would reveal his identity to her and, well, she knew that she could be trustworthy with his identity. She wouldn't tell anyone. Not a single soul. Secrets were something that she was excellent at keeping. But Spider-Man was trusting her here, putting his life in her very hands. She knew that she couldn't betray that trust, not due to simple curiosity on her part, and especially not because he felt a little uncomfortable in the skin-tight fabric. No, you can't take the suit off. It would be dangerous. How was it possible for Spider-Man to look confused as he glanced at her? There was just something about the mask that seemed so open and expressive. A reason that she couldn't quite put her finger on as to how it was even possible. But Mary Jane decided that she liked it. After a moment, Spider-Man seemed to accept what she said and leaned more heavily against her, fully relying on her support. His arm came around her shoulder, and hers went around his waist as she helped to sustain his footing. Let's go, Mary Jane said, more insistent than before. The sirens were getting louder now, which meant that they were close. We don't have much more time. Mary Jane led him out of the alleyway and down the darkened street towards her Aunt Anna's apartment building. It was rather lucky that they hadn't been seen, but it seemed that the police and the fire trucks had gone to the next street over to deal with the burning building. The process of getting to the apartment was a slow one. Mary Jane wasn't used to supporting so much weight, and Spider-Man seemed to be hissing in pain with every other step. But she didn't complain, no matter how long it was taking them. In fact, she was just glad to prove that she was being useful to someone in such a clear example. Her dad, in the midst of his drunken binges and usually after a fight with her mom, would sometimes call Mary Jane useless. It was gratifying to be able to prove him wrong, if only to herself. And besides that, she was still in awe of the fact that she was currently touching a superhero, someone who had fought with and against the Avengers in Berlin, the guy who had defeated the Vulture, saving New York from being plagued from more alien tech than it knew what to do with. It was almost too surreal for her to believe that he was here with her, even as it was happening in real time. So how could she complain when this is probably the most exciting thing that has happened to her in the longest time? But even further than that, she was just glad to be helping him. There was something about his mannerisms, his voice, that caused her to take an instant liking to him. She was worried about the pain that he was in, the loss of his memory, and whether she was making the right decision by omitting taking him to the hospital. But she felt in her gut that she was making the correct choice for him in the grand scheme of things. When they finally made it, Mary Jane led him down the alleyway outside of the apartment building and guided him up the fire escape until they reached one of the bedroom windows of her aunt's apartment. "You have to wait here for me," Mary Jane told him as she set him down on the metal fire escape platform, propped up against the window to the guest room that belonged to her aunt.
Wait!
He said, his hand shot up to grab at her arm, his voice hinging on panic.
Where are you going?
Mary Jane stared at him for a mere moment, before she lifted her hand and patted the one he had on her arm, reassuring. "I'm just going to go into the building through the front door. I have to unlock my aunt's apartment and let you in through the window." Spider-Man didn't let go of her arm as she tried to pull away. Mary Jane turned wide eyes to his hand, his unmovable hand of steel that she couldn't quite manage to break free from. So he did have super strength.
Can't I come with you?
Spider-Man asked, his voice so small that her heart may have melted just a bit. Mary Jane immediately shook her head. "You can't be seen walking through the lobby in your suit." Spider-Man tilted his head at her curiously.
But why?
Mary Jane sighed as she looked around anxiously, wanting to get him into the apartment before he could be seen. "I'll explain later. Look, I promise I'll be quick. You won't even have time to miss me."
I doubt that,
Spider-Man said as he finally loosened his grip on her arm, letting her go. Mary Jane's eyes snapped up to him in shock at his words. The pulsating in her chest sped up after skipping a beat. Heat swarmed in her gut, before she allowed the smile that was fighting against her lips. Why did those 3 simple words make her feel so giddy? "I'll be back soon," she said as she straightened from her crouch, before she ran gingerly down the fire escape stairs as fast as was safe for her to do on the creaky metal. When Mary Jane finally reached the pavement below, she took a second to quickly peer up at the spot where she knew Spider-Man was sitting and was glad to see that he was barely visible in the darkness. No witnesses have spotted them yet. Then, not wanting to waste any time or break her promise to him, she quickly turned the corner at a brisk pace and made it to the apartment lobby doors. The wait for the elevator was unbearable for Mary Jane. She fidgeted and glanced every which way as she willed for the elevator to come to the lobby floor. The sight that she made to any onlookers she could only imagine. When the ding came that accompanied the action of the elevator doors opening, Mary Jane nearly cried out in praise. When she was finally let out on the floor that her aunt's apartment was located, Mary Jane ran to the correct door and jammed the key into the lock for the apartment. After some fumbling, she finally managed to get the door open, turn on the light, and there he was, still propped up against the window, waiting patiently for her arrival. She had suddenly realized how silly she had been. It had been subconsciously put into her head that he would disappear as soon as she let him out of her sight. But that worry was all for naught. Mary Jane smiled and stepped forward, making sure to close and lock the door behind her, before going straight to the window, unlatching the clasp, and opening it for him. He turned at the scraping sound of the window pane extending upward, and she helped him through the now accessible gap.
You were wrong,
Spider-Man said as she laid him out on the tidily made bed next to the window, taking the time to prop and fluff the pillows so that his head was supported.
I did miss you. I was nervous out there by myself.
It was at that moment where it suddenly hit her. How young Spider-Man's voice actually sounded. Exactly how old was he? Could it be that Spider-Man was only a teenager? Like her? The implications of that were startling. Yet it would explain why he wasn't an official Avenger. Mary Jane beamed at him, his words coaxing at a part inside of her that fluttered, and replied saucily, Well, it's difficult not to miss me, Spider. To say that Mary Jane was confident was an understatement. It was clear very early on that her parents had no faith or confidence in her. So she made up for it by having all the confidence in herself. She made sure to have big aspirations. She wanted to be an actress and a model. She wanted to prove her worth by making it big, to prove her parents wrong. So, for Mary Jane to flirt with an injured superhero with amnesia while alone in her aunt's apartment, it was a challenge that Mary Jane was willing to accept. She was brought back from her thoughts at the breathy laugh that escaped Spider-Man at her words.
I'm not surprised you are, well...
What? She asked.
Well, you're very pretty,
She couldn't suppress a smile at his words. There was that giddy feeling again. Mary Jane.
Mary Jane.
Spider-Man said, testing out her name for himself.
So, how do we know each other, Mary Jane?
Mary Jane tucked a strand of her red hair behind her ear and sat down next to where he lay on the mattress. Well, you actually don't. I only just found you unconscious in that alleyway. Spider-Man sat up slightly, propped up by his elbows, and tilted his head, looking at her.
So you can't tell me anything at all about me?
Mary Jane shook her head slightly, before pausing to say, all that I can tell you is that you are a Spider-Man. You live in New York, and you are the local superhero. I don't know your real identity. No one does. That's why you wear that mask and why you can't take it off. How was it possible for Spider-Man to look shocked by her words? Perhaps it was in the way that his whole body stiffened?
Wow.
Was all that he managed to say as he stared at her with those white eyepieces. Mary Jane nodded, realizing how extraordinary and shocking it would be to be told that you were a superhero without first knowing it yourself. You have these powers, you see, Mary Jane said, starting to actually feel a tad bit nervous under his eyeless gaze. You could stick to walls, and you have super strength, and you could shoot webbing out of your wrists, which you used to swing from building to building. Spider-Man sat up even more, seemingly more astonished than ever.
I can do all that?
Mary Jane nodded, allowing a grin to grow on her face. Face it, Spider, you're a real hero. You've saved a lot of people and stopped a lot of criminals. You've even fought with the Avengers.
Who are the Avengers?
Spider-Man asked. Confusion painted his tone. They are a group of superheroes that fight together sometimes. That was essentially the understatement of the century. She trailed off as she thought of the Avengers. Perhaps they could help Spider-Man? But she had no way of knowing how to get into contact with any of them. Short of alerting the media and announcing that she had Spider-Man in her aunt's apartment and they needed to come and help him. Which was obviously out of the question.
You must be a good person,
Spider-Man said suddenly, breaking her out of her thoughts, while simultaneously startling her with a genuine compliment.
To protect my identity like this, and to help me when I can't remember anything.
For the first time, Mary Jane actually blushed. She had never heard something so nice that was said to her before. Well, she normally only got compliments from people about her looks. Never before had she been told that someone thought that she was a good person. It made her feel light. There was a brief prick of tears in her eyes before she hastily pushed it away, hoping she did so before he noticed how affected she's become by his simple words. She paused, unsure of what to say to such a thing, before she finally settled on a quiet, "Thank you."
You're welcome,
Spider-Man said back, in just as soft of a voice as his gloved hand reached out and grasped hers gently. They held hands for a measurable amount of time. With each second passing, Mary Jane felt her heart beat faster, and her breathing quicken. Her cheeks were positively flaming, most likely as red as her hair by this point. What was wrong with her? She was Mary Jane Watson. She had all the confidence in the world. She never let herself get worked up over something as silly as the male gender. It was the guys that she encountered that reacted this way to her, not the other way around. And yet, as she thought all of this, she found herself becoming dizzy, as all of her attention and focus was on where her hand was clasped within his. Was she, perhaps, infatuated? She wasn't sure. She had never had an experience like this to compare this feeling to.
So,
Spider-Man said suddenly, breaking the silence. She was glad. She didn't think that she had been capable of speech until his voice broke through the foggy spell that her mind had been put under.
Since you can't tell me much about who I am, what do you suppose we do?
Mary Jane bit her lip, glad that the question distracted her from the dilemma that she was facing within. Well, I had been thinking about that. I thought that maybe we could try to let the Avengers know. But I have no idea how we could even begin to contact them. Not to mention that since the Sokovia Accords, the Avengers have mostly disbanded. The only Avenger that I can think that might actually be in the city would be Tony Stark.
Wait, Tony?
Spider-Man shot up into a sitting position on the bed as he suddenly interrupted. Mary Jane turned to him, a flash of surprise in her eyes. You remember that name? Spider-Man nodded, before pausing immediately.
Yes and no. I mean, it does sound familiar. When you said it just now, something like a memory came back to me.
Mary Jane's eyes widened as she turned towards him more insistently, fully facing him now. A memory? Like what?
It was of Tony. He called me kid and something about how if I'm nothing without the suit, then I shouldn't have it.
Spider-Man trailed off, his entire demeanor becoming quite somber as his head bowed towards his lap. What is it? Mary Jane asked, marveling at what he had just told her. For one, confirming that Spider-Man was, in fact, quite young from how Tony Stark had called him kid. Spider-Man shook his head, rubbing the gloved hand that wasn't holding hers down his face.
It's nothing. It's just that I didn't like how I felt when he had said that he had wanted to take away my suit. It must have been a real low point for me.
The vulnerability that he displayed right then made him seem so human to Mary Jane. It made him more of a person to her and less of a heroic icon. She squeezed his hand and smiled widely at him. But don't you see? You remembered something. You might be getting your memory back. Spider-Man's demeanor seemed to lighten measurably at her words as he replied,
Maybe if we keep talking, more will come back to me.
He seemed excited at the prospect, and Mary Jane marveled at the simple fact that he was facing this situation bravely and head-on, instead of freaking out as most people would. Let's talk about Tony Stark some more. Maybe you'll remember some way to be able to contact him so he can help. And so they talked, both completely unaware that the man that they were currently speaking about was consoling a worried aunt at that very moment, concerning her missing nephew. Hey everybody, thank you so much for listening to Chapter 2 of Spider-Who. Again, I would like to give a heartfelt thank you to everybody who has volunteered their voices and also their time towards this audiobook series that we are producing for you and your enjoyment. That also includes my editor, who devoted his time to put this together. Please go subscribe to him. He has a YouTube channel. I'll link it down below in the description. Please let me know your thoughts and comments. I love reading them, and also remember to like and subscribe. Oh, and turn on the little bell icon so that you know when the next chapter drops, so that you can continue listening. And until next time, peace, love, joy, and happiness to you all.